the tank they ridiculed, and the war it refused to lose. On paper, it should have died in its first week. A medium tank with a cramped two-man turret, a transmission that could break your will, optics that lagged behind German glass, and a finish so rough it looked like it had been assembled with hammers and curses. German crews called it Crude. Some Soviet crews did too, quietly, because the Red Army wasn't exactly a place where quietly kept you safe. And yet, by the middle of the war, this thin-skinned, badly made machine becomes the armored heartbeat of the Eastern Front, not because it was perfect, but because it kept moving, because it could be built when everything else couldn't, because it survived the part of war most weapons never even face: mud, cold, distance, and production math. That's the paradox. The T-34 wasn't the best tank in the way people like to argue about tanks. It was the tank that could exist again and again under conditions designed to erase nations. Picture the first time it really matters. Samma etesinne oni hundrade och enofyra. The air is hot. The roads are dust or rutted track. And entire Soviet formations are disintegrating under the speed of Barbarossa. You're a Soviet tank crewman being rushed forward with a vehicle you barely know. The manuals are scarce. The radios, if you even have one, are unreliable. Your commander is trying to interpret shouted orders over engine noise and artillery thuds. And somewhere ahead of you, German Panzer crews are still riding high on a belief that their system is the future: better training, better coordination, better leadership, better machines. Then the T-34 appears in their sights. At first, the Germans are confused. Early war German anti-tank guns, the famous 37mm. The door knocker sometimes bounce off the sloped frontal armor at awkward angles. That armor isn't magic. Its geometry a moderately thick plate, angled hard, forcing incoming rounds to glance and waste their energy. The Germans are used to armor being thickness. The T-34 makes armor a math problem. And the gun, a 76, 2mm cannon that, in 1941, can punch through the front of many German tanks at typical engagement ranges. Not always, not flawlessly, but often enough that the first encounters produce a rare feeling in the German system: hesitation. So why the ridicule? Why the thin-skinned reputation? Because war isn't a duel. It's a system. And the T-34 is about to collide with the uglier parts of that system: logistics, manufacturing, human limits, and the fact that good enough is sometimes better than best when you need 10,000 of something yesterday. Inside the tank, it's not romantic. The turret is cramped. Early models often lack a dedicated loader, meaning the commander is also trying to observe, command, and help load or aim depending on crew layout. In a fight, that is a recipe for tunnel vision. German tanks, even when weaker on paper, often have better crew ergonomics and better optics. In 1941, German tactical doctrine is a force multiplier: radios in more tanks, practiced coordination, and a tempo of decision-making that turns individual vehicles into a single moving organism. So in the micro world, the moment-to-moment experience, your T-34 can feel like a blunt instrument, and blunt instruments still break. The T-34's early mechanical reliability is not the myth people want it to be. Clutches burn out, gearboxes fight you, tracks wear, engines need careful maintenance you don't always have time for. The air filters critical in dust can be inadequate. A tank that should dominate can become a stranded steel box because the war doesn't care about your brochure specs. But here's the shift. Here's where the story stops being about a single tank design and becomes about a civilization turning itself into an assembly line. Because even as Soviet crews curse their transmissions and German crews praise their optics, the real battlefield is moving east into workshops, rail yards, and factory floors. The Soviet Union is about to do something that feels impossible even now: relocate industry on a continental scale while fighting for survival. And the T-34 rough, weld-scarred, simplified, starts changing with the war around it. Not always toward elegance, often toward speed, toward manufacturability, toward the grim realization that if your tank takes twice as long to build, it might as well not exist. This is where the macro perspective hits like an avalanche. You can talk about quality versus quantity all day, but the Eastern Front turns it into a physical reality: kilometers of mud, temperatures that kill men and machines, and a front line that eats armored vehicles at a rate peacetime engineers can't emotionally process. Tanks aren't treasured machines here, they're consumables. So the Soviet approach becomes brutally rational: reduce complexity, standardize parts, accept imperfections, and keep output flowing. The T-34's design diesel engine, wide tracks for soft ground, sloped armor for weight efficiency doesn't just suit combat. It suits mass production under stress. It suits being built by workers who are cold, hungry, exhausted, and still expected to hit quotas. And somewhere in 1942, the German army begins to face the nightmare it didn't plan for. Not a better tank, but a tank that won't stop coming. Because the T-34 isn't trying to win as a masterpiece. It's trying to win as a species. What if the T-34's crudeness wasn't a flaw at all, but the weapon? If you want to understand why the T-34 becomes a symbol of endurance, you don't start with armor, thickness, or horsepower. You start with trains. Not glamorous trains, evacuation trains, the kind packed with machine tools, half-disassembled presses, lathes wrapped in grease-soaked cloth, crates of gauges and jigs, and frightened engineers who know exactly what happens if they don't get the line running again. In 1941, as German armies surge deeper into the USSR, the Soviet state makes a decision that is both insane and rational. It will relocate vast portions of its industrial base beyond the reach of capture east of the Urals, while still trying to feed the front. This isn't a tidy move. It's controlled panic at national scale. Factories that once made locomotives, tractors, and steel components are ordered to become tank plants. Entire production lines are broken down, hauled thousands of kilometers, and rebuilt in places that often lack proper housing, heating, or even finished roofs. Workers arrive to find mud, snow, and a factory skeleton. They build walls while trying to build tanks. They sleep in barracks, basements, makeshift huts, sometimes in the same buildings where they work, and the T-34 fits this chaos better than it has any right to. Because the tank's defining trait isn't refinement, it's tolerance. A design that can accept rough welds. A design that can be simplified without losing its core advantages. A design that can be produced with imperfect tools and inconsistent labor, because perfection is a luxury the Eastern Front doesn't allow. This is the war's most brutal engineering lesson. The best weapon is not the one with the highest performance in a test range. It's the one you can still produce when your country is on fire. Now zoom in to the micro level. Imagine you're a foreman in a newly relocated plant. The old shop floor is gone. Half your skilled labor force is at the front. The new workers are teenagers, older men, women pulled from other trades, people who can learn, but who have no time to become artisans. You have shortages of alloying elements, shortages of rubber, shortages of precision bearings, and someone from the state is asking about output targets like reality is negotiable. So the T-34 changes often in ways that look like downgrades if you don't understand the math. Castings replace complex machined parts where possible. Weld seams get uglier because the priority is speed and adequate strength, not aesthetics. Finishing steps that once took hours get cut to minutes. You see rough edges and uneven plates not because Soviet engineers don't care, but because every additional hour per tank is a tax on survival. Even the turret story becomes a perfect example of wartime logic. Early T-34 turrets are cramped, and the crew arrangement is less efficient than German practice. In a perfect world, you'd redesign everything. In the real world, you gradually evolve it while still shipping tanks. You transition through variants, learning painfully, adapting whenever the production system can absorb the change. The goal is not to create a flawless tank. It's to keep an assembly line alive while the enemy is trying to erase it. And here's the part that feels almost cynical. The Soviet Union doesn't need each individual T-34 to be exceptional. It needs the average T-34 to be good enough and present in overwhelming numbers. Because on the Eastern Front, the tank's most powerful feature may be availability, the ability to replace losses, the ability to keep units equipped, the ability to roll fresh machines onto the line after a catastrophic encirclement, after a retreat, after an entire brigade burns. Germany's war economy, by contrast, is about to run into the inverse problem. German tank design culture leans towards sophistication, high-performance optics, complex transmissions, tight manufacturing tolerances, and later, increasingly heavy armor that demands more engine, more steel, more time. This produces brilliant machines. It also produces bottlenecks. The more advanced you make the system, the more fragile it becomes under strategic pressure bombing, resource shortages, disrupted supply chains. This isn't a moral argument. It's logistics. A factory that can build 2 highly complex tanks in the time another factory builds 5 simpler tanks is making a bet that those 2 will always be worth more than the 5. Sometimes that bet works tactically, but war isn't just tactics. It's replacement rates, spare parts, maintenance hours, fuel availability, rail capacity, and whether your workforce can keep manufacturing under attack. The T-34 thrives in this realm because it was never a delicate instrument. Its wide tracks are an engineering solution that doubles as a logistical advantage. In mud and snow, a tank's mobility is about ground pressure as much as engine power. A vehicle that sinks less can keep moving when roads disappear, and on the Eastern Front, roads often do disappear into Rasputitsa, mud seas in spring and autumn, into ice in winter, into dust and ruts in summer. And then there's the engine. A diesel engine reduces fire risk compared to gasoline tanks in certain hit scenarios, and it's also tied to fuel realities. Diesel logistics are still brutal, but the Soviet system increasingly standardizes around the flows it can sustain. The T-34 becomes not just a battlefield object, but a node in a supply network that is being reassembled in real time. But endurance has a cost. The same production logic that keeps tanks rolling out also means crews receive machines with inconsistent quality. Some have better welds, some worse. Some have transmissions that behave, some that feel like they were assembled by a man racing an execution clock because, in a sense, they were. Crews learn to carry tools like lifelines. Maintenance becomes ritual. A tank is not a finished product. It's a living project you keep alive. And this is where the irony deepens. The T-34's crudeness is not merely tolerated, it becomes operational doctrine. The Red Army starts to accept that a percentage of tanks will fail mechanically before meeting the enemy. That is horrifying. It is also, in the brutal calculus of 1,942, acceptable if the alternative is having no tanks at all. So the question becomes, if the Soviets can keep building, can they keep learning faster than the Germans can adapt? Because Germany doesn't stand still. It reacts. It upgrades guns, changes tactics, introduces heavier armor, and begins fielding machines designed specifically to kill T-34s. The battlefield becomes an arms race, and the T-34's survival will be tested not just by mud and factory quotas, but by something far more personal. German crews who figure out exactly how to destroy it. It's the one that learns how to kill yours faster than you can replace it. The first time a German crew watches a round bounce off a T-34's sloped front, it feels like a technical insult. The second time, it becomes a tactical problem. By the third time, it becomes policy. Because the Eastern Front has a way of stripping illusions down to their mechanical core. In 1941, the T-34's armor geometry and 76mm gun create genuine shock. But shock is temporary. The Germans do what competent armies do, they adapt. And the moment they do, the T-34 is forced to prove whether its legend is about invulnerability or about survivability. Those are not the same thing. Here's the uncomfortable reality: the T-34 was never a magic shield. Its frontal armor could be defeated. Its turret was more vulnerable. Its side armor especially was dangerous thin. The early war problem wasn't that the tank couldn't be killed. It was that the Germans didn't always have the right tools in the right place at the right time. And their assumptions lagged behind what Soviet industry had put on tracks. But adaptation is a German specialty in 1941, 1942. The 37mm fades from relevance. The 50mm becomes more common. The 75mm guns first in anti-tank roles. Then increasingly mounted on tanks start to dominate. If the door knocker once made crews joke, the newer guns make them stop joking. And you can feel the shift on the ground. A T-34 commander in 1941 might push forward with confidence, trusting his frontal silhouette and speed. By 1942, that confidence becomes conditional. You don't linger. You don't present your side. You don't crest hills slowly. You don't assume the enemy is underarmed anymore. Because now, the T-34 is being hunted by weapons built to solve the T-34 problem. This is where the micro perspective becomes terrifyingly human. Imagine you're inside the tank when the hit comes. The sound is not like Hollywood. It's a concussive hammer blow through the hull, metal screaming. The shock traveling through your bones. Sometimes the round penetrates, and the interior becomes a storm of fragments spalling. Shattered fittings. Shards that turn air into a weapon. Sometimes it doesn't penetrate but still cracks welds. Yams turret rings. Damages optics. Breaks the engine. Non-penetration can still mean you're dead. Because a tank that cannot move is a target waiting to be finished. And that vulnerability is why German tactics evolve into something almost clinical. They learn to avoid frontal shots when possible and target flanks. They coordinate anti-tank guns with infantry and terrain. They use concealment. They draw tanks into kill zones. The duel stops being tank versus tank and becomes system versus system, combined arms versus massed armor, ambush versus momentum. Now zoom out to the macro level, and you see why this becomes a race the Germans struggle to win. Every time Germany solves the T-34, tactically new guns, better ammunition, improved tactics, the Soviet Union answers with something that isn't as glamorous. More tanks, more crews, more replacement units, more operational depth. Germany's solutions are often local and lethal. The Soviet solution is structural. And then Germany introduces the machines that history loves to worship. The Panther, the Tiger, bigger guns, thicker armor, optics that feel like cheating, and performance that can make a T-34 look outclassed in a straight duel. On the range, on paper, in the clean geometry of a one-on-one engagement, the German heavy tanks can dominate. So why doesn't that end the story? Because duels are not wars. Those German machines arrive with their own paradox. The very sophistication that makes them terrifying also makes them fragile in the wrong way. Production fragility, maintenance fragility, supply fragility. A tank that requires more precision labor is a tank that suffers when precision labor is bombed, drafted, or exhausted. A tank that is heavier is a tank that eats fuel, strains transmissions, breaks bridges, and needs recovery vehicles that may not exist. Meanwhile, the T-34, still flawed, still rough, keeps benefiting from its core trait. It is survivable as a program. This is where the thin-skinned label becomes more interesting than it sounds. Compared to late-war German heavies, the T-34's armor is not thick. It can be penetrated. But its survivability doesn't come purely from armor thickness. It comes from mobility, choosing when and where fights happen, and from the fact that the Soviet system can afford to lose tanks and keep attacking. That sounds cold. And it is. But it changes how battles behave. If you have to preserve every machine, you fight cautiously. If you can replace machines, you can fight aggressively. That difference shapes the operational tempo of entire fronts. And somewhere in 1943, The T-34 is about to face the most decisive stress test imaginable, a battlefield where Germany concentrates anti-tank power, elite crews, and the newest armored designs. And the Soviet Union meets them with production, planning, and the raw confidence that comes from knowing your enemy can't replace losses like you can. That battlefield is Kursk, and Kursk is where the T-34 stops being the tank that surprised Germany and becomes something far more consequential. The tank that forces Germany to spend its remaining strength just to keep up. When Germany finally brought its best to kill the T-34, why did it still feel like the T-34 was winning? Even while burning Kursk is often described like a single cinematic collision tanks cresting ridgelines, guns flashing, steel grinding against steel. That's the postcard. The reality is uglier and more analytical. Kursk is a deliberate experiment in industrial warfare, where both sides try to convert logistics into firepower faster than the other can absorb it. It is not just a battle, it's a measurement of preparation, of repair capacity, of replacement speed, of whether your entire war economy can sustain the way you fight. And for the T-34, Kursk is the moment its paradox becomes undeniable. Because if you want to kill T-34s, Kursk is exactly where you would try. The Germans concentrate new armored formations and anti-tank capability, including Panthers entering combat in significant numbers and Tigers deployed as spearhead weapons. They plan an offensive designed to bite through layered Soviet defenses and then roll forward, severing the bulge like a surgeon. But surgeons need clean operating rooms. Kursk is not clean. Kursk is a minefield, wrapped in artillery, wrapped in anti-tank guns, wrapped in depth defenses that go back for miles. It is engineering used as violence trenches, obstacles, camouflage, pre-registered kill zones. The Red Army doesn't just wait. It builds the battlefield it wants. This is where the macro planning becomes intimate. Imagine a Soviet engineer unit in the weeks before July 1943. The ground is hard in places and muddy in others. Men dig until their hands split. They emplace mines by the thousands. They mark lanes, bury wire, shape earth into geometry. Their work isn't glamorous, but it changes physics. It forces German tanks to slow, to bunch up, to expose themselves to artillery and anti-tank fire. And that's the trap. Not a trap in the romantic sense, more like the cruel logic of forcing a mechanized army to fight at the speed of a shovel. Now take the micro perspective again inside a T-34. The morning begins with vibration engines idling. The air thick with dust and exhaust. Crew members checking what they can, pretending they're calm. You feel the heat in the fighting compartment even before movement. You smell fuel and oil. You hear distant guns like an approaching storm. You know there are mines. You know there are German guns calibrated for your silhouette. And you still move forward. Because the whole point is momentum. Break their spearheads. Crush their tempo. Make their best bleed itself out against your depth. This is where Western audiences often misunderstand the Eastern Front. They imagine the T-34 as the hero in a duel against Tigers. In reality, the hero, if you can call it that, is the system that keeps the T-34 appearing in the first place. German Tigers can dominate tactically, but they are rare. Panthers are more numerous. But in mid-1943 they are new, rushed, and plagued by mechanical issues in their early combat debut. The German offensive begins with a kind of self-inflicted friction, vehicles breaking down, transmissions failing, engines overheating, recovery operations clogging routes. And suddenly, the German side is tasting the same bitter truth the Soviets swallowed earlier. You can have the best design intentions in the world and still lose to maintenance reality. Meanwhile, the T-34 still imperfect functions inside a doctrine built around imperfection. It is used in waves, supported by artillery, integrated into a defense-in-depth concept that is explicitly meant to bleed attackers. The Soviets are not trying to preserve every tank. They are trying to preserve the front. There's a difference that changes everything. So the battle becomes a spectacle of contradictions. German tanks push forward and die to mines and anti-tank guns before they even get to fight enemy armor. Soviet tanks surge and get cut apart by superior German optics and gunnery, then more Soviet tanks arrive. The ground fills with wrecks that become obstacles. Smoke blinds gunners. Dust turns optics into guesswork. Radios fail. Commanders lose track of units. The duel degrades into industrial chaos. And then you reach the point where the T-34's thin skin becomes a strategic advantage in disguise. Not because it's safer, because it's lighter. A lighter tank is easier to recover, easier to tow, easier to move across marginal bridges, easier to transport by rail, easier to manufacture with less steel per unit. When you're building and losing tanks at scale, these details aren't trivia. They are the war. A heavier German tank that breaks down can become a stranded monument. Recovery vehicles may be insufficient. Fuel may be insufficient. Spare parts may not arrive. A vehicle that cannot be recovered becomes a permanent loss even before the enemy finishes it. And at Kursk, this begins to matter in a way German planning cannot fully solve. Because the Soviet system is designed to absorb shock and keep functioning, the German system, more reliant on elite crews and high-performance machines, begins to show a painful weakness. It cannot replace losses fast enough. And it cannot sustain high-intensity offensive operations without burning its future. This is why winning at Kursk is so weird. Germany can win local engagements. Germany can destroy large numbers of Soviet tanks. German gunners can still perform miracles of accuracy and calm under pressure. But the offensive bleeds out because it cannot convert tactical successes into strategic breakthrough. The deeper it pushes, the more it consumes fuel. Parts, crews, time. And time is the one resource Germany does not have. The Soviet side, by contrast, can lose thousands of vehicles and still keep the line coherent, because behind the line, repair depots cannibalize wrecks. Factories keep shipping replacements. Training pipelines keep filling crews. It's not elegant. It's brutal continuity. And then the operational turning point comes like an insult while Germany is still trying to force the bulge open. The wider war demands attention elsewhere, and the initiative slips away. Kursk does not end the war in a day, but it shifts the argument. After Kursk, Germany increasingly fights to delay. The Soviet Union increasingly fights to advance, and the T-34 becomes not just a tank, but a statement: we can take damage, we can replace it, and we can keep coming. But here's the cliffhanger, the uncomfortable twist in the T-34 legend. If the tank was winning through endurance, what happens when endurance alone is no longer enough? Because as the war moves into 1944, the Red Army's offensive ambitions expand deeper, faster, farther. The distances grow, the supply lines stretch, the enemy adapts again. And suddenly, the T-34's biggest flaw, the cramped turret and limited command and control, starts to threaten the very momentum it helped create. By 1944, the T-34 is no longer fighting for survival. It's fighting for momentum. That sounds like a victory. It's also a new kind of danger. When you're defending, you can build your battlefield like Kursk depth. Means pre-planned kill zones, artillery maps, defensive geometry. When you're attacking across hundreds of kilometers, you inherit a different enemy distance. Roads that vanish, rivers that slow you, fuel that doesn't arrive, radios that crackle and die right when you need coordination, and German defenses that are no longer trying to win the whole war in one blow, but to make every kilometer cost you blood and machines. The T-34 helped turn the war's tide, but now the war is asking the T-34 to do something harder: chase a retreating, adapting enemy across broken Europe, and still win tactical fights against the best anti-tank weapons Germany has left. And here is the quiet confession the Soviet system makes, not in speeches, but in steel. The original T-34's turret is no longer good enough. The 76mm gun that once shocked German crews in 1941–42 is increasingly outclassed by the armor and engagement ranges of late-war combat. German tanks and anti-tank guns have improved. Panthers and Tigers still not everywhere appear in enough places to force a response, even where heavy tanks are absent. German anti-tank defenses have teeth-long barreled guns, better ammo, layered ambush positions. A Soviet tank that cannot reliably penetrate at realistic ranges is forced into closer, riskier fights, and riskier on the Eastern Front is a synonym for more burning wrecks. So the T-34 needs a bigger gun. But a bigger gun is not just a barrel swap, it's a systems problem. A larger gun requires more recoil space, more turret ring strength, more ammunition handling room, and critically more crew efficiency. This is where the micro-level matters again. In the cramped early turret, the commander's workload is punishing. He's trying to see, decide, and communicate in an environment that is loud, hot, and often partially blind from dust and shock. If you've never been inside an armored vehicle, picture trying to coordinate a firefight while someone slams a metal garbage can next to your ear and shakes your chair like an earthquake every time you fire. Now add speed. Soviet offensives in 1944 demand rapid exploitation punch through, flood the rear, collapse pockets, seize crossings, keep moving. That requires coordination. Coordination requires communications. Communications require radios that work, and a commander who can command rather than physically fight his own machine. The old setup is an endurance design. The new war demands a killing design. So the Soviet Union does what it has been doing since 1941. It evolves the machine without stopping the line. Enter the T-3485. This is where the T-34 becomes something many people don't fully appreciate. It becomes a platform rather than a single design. The hull stays largely familiar wide tracks, sloped armor profile, diesel engine concept, mass production friendly structure, but the turret changes dramatically. A larger, roomier turret with a bigger gun, and, crucially, better crew workflow. The commander's ability to observe and command becomes less of a fantasy and more of a real function. That's the technical core of the upgrade, not just bigger gun, but improved combat management. Because armor battles are not won purely by penetration charts, they're won by who sees first, decides first, and shoots first, then relocates before return fire finds them. And seeing first is often optics and vantage, while deciding first is doctrine and crew ergonomics. And shooting first is a combination of gun performance and stable firing conditions. The T-3485 is the Soviet attempt to close the gap in that whole chain. Now, let's be slightly cynical for a moment. This upgrade is also a concession that German design philosophy dedicated commander role. Better situational awareness was correct in the tactical domain. The Soviets weren't wrong to prioritize mass and mobility early, but by 1944, the Red Army is no longer a force that can afford to be tactically inefficient just because it can replace losses. Every unnecessary loss slows the advance. Every stalled spearhead gives Germany time to form a new line. Every broken bridge, every delayed fuel convoy, every night without rest becomes an opportunity for the defender. So the machine adapts to the strategy. And this is where the macro perspective becomes coldly impressive. The Soviet Union manages to introduce a significant combat improvement while still producing at scale. That's not easy. Tooling changes, training changes, ammunition supply changes, spare parts pipeline changes. You're not just building a new turret, you're rewiring part of the Army's operational bloodstream. On the battlefield, the payoff is real. The T-3485 can engage German armor with more confidence. And just as importantly, it can do so as part of a faster-moving, better coordinated combined arms force. It doesn't suddenly become invincible. It still burns. But the balance shifts. It becomes harder for German crews to rely on range dominance alone. And the Soviet side becomes better at turning contact into breakthrough rather than contact into attrition. But this doesn't mean the story becomes simple, because Germany's late-war defense is not only about tanks, It's about anti-tank guns, ambush tactics, infantry with portable weapons, ARVN kill zones, and the strategic collapse of infrastructure that turns speed into a logistical nightmare. The Red Army can have better tanks and still be slowed by the simple fact that roads are destroyed, bridges are blown, and supply depots are cratered. So here is the question the T-34's evolution forces us to ask. If the T-34 wins by endurance, and then upgrades to win by efficiency, what is the true weapon? Is it the steel, or is it the system that keeps steel-moving factories? Rails, to fuel, crews, doctrine. Because the deeper the Soviets push, the more the war becomes about a different kind of machine, the logistics machine. And it's there behind the famous battles that the T-34's legend becomes almost secondary to the real engine of victory. A tank doesn't win wars by being the best tank. It wins by being the tank that can be fed, fixed, and fielded longer than the enemy can keep fighting. If you freeze the war into a single frame, the T-34's legend looks like armor and firepower. But wars don't happen in frames, they happen in flows. A tank is only good for as long as it can be fueled, repaired, crewed, and moved to the right place at the right time. And by 1944, the Red Army's problem is no longer, can we build tanks? It's can we keep tanks alive at the speed of an offensive? Because offensive warfare turns the map into a conveyor belt of breakage. Tracks wear down, road wheels shatter, engines choke on dust, gearboxes grind themselves into metal paste. Crews fall apart psychologically. Every kilometer forward increases the distance back to your depots. Every captured town gives you ruined infrastructure instead of usable workshops. Every bridge you cross is another bridge that might collapse under the next vehicle. This is where the T-34's real main character emerges, not the tank, but the ecosystem around it. Start with recovery. On the Eastern Front, a tank that is immobilized is not automatically a tank that is lost. The question is, can you get to it, tow it, and repair it before the enemy either captures it or turns it into scrap? Recovery is a dirty, dangerous job. It happens under artillery threat, in mud, in darkness, sometimes with enemy infantry still nearby. It requires specialized vehicles, cables, crews who understand how to pull a 50,000-pound object without snapping gear or rolling into a ditch. A heavy German tank that breaks down deep in contested territory can become a liability because recovering it is harder. It might need more powerful recovery vehicles, more time, more fuel. It might be too heavy for marginal bridges. If you can't recover it, you may have to destroy your own machine to prevent capture. And that, from a production standpoint, is a tragedy. You've lost, not just a weapon, but months of labor. Now look at the Soviet side. The T-34's relative lightness and simpler construction make recovery more feasible in many situations. That doesn't mean it's easy. It means the Red Army can sometimes treat immobilized tanks as repairable assets rather than permanent losses. Tanks get towed to field repair points. Crews cannibalize parts. Wrecks become organ donors. A tank battalion's strength is not just what's currently running, it's what can be revived. This is industrial biology, and it's one reason the T-34 can appear endless to German troops. A tank you thought you destroyed might be back weeks later with a new engine and a welded scar across its hull like a healed wound. Then there's the rail network. Armored warfare is often depicted as purely mechanized, but the backbone is steel rails. Tanks don't drive from factories to fronts across continents. They ride trains to railheads, then drive from there. This is why the Soviet decision to relocate industry east matters so much. It preserves production and integrates it with rail distribution. If the rail system functions even under bombing and sabotage, you can move mass. So the T-34's success is tied to a logistical architecture: factories feeding trains feeding depots feeding units. It's not romantic. It's decisive. And then there's fuel, the quiet killer of offensives. A tank without fuel is a pillbox. Fuel logistics are not just about having enough, they're about timing and distribution. Fuel convoys become targets. Roads clog. Containers leak. Winter turns everything into gel and ice. Summer turns everything into dust. The Soviet system has to keep fuel moving forward in an environment where forward changes every day. This is where the T-34's design choice diesel intersects with the larger economy. Diesel supply chains are still complicated, but standardization matters. If you can simplify what fuels what, you simplify storage, transport, and distribution. You reduce the number of failure points in an already fragile network. But the most human factor in this entire machine is crews. A tank is not a product. It's a relationship between metal and men. By 1944-45, experienced Soviet tankers are valuable not just because they can shoot well, but because they know how not to die stupidly. They know how to read terrain. They know how to coordinate with infantry. They know when to relocate, when to push, and when to stop because a gearbox sound has changed, and if they ignore it, the tank will betray them at the worst moment. And here's the grim truth. High losses mean many crews are not experienced. The Red Army has to train replacements constantly. Training pipelines are under pressure. New crews arrive with minimal hours. They learn in combat. And that is why having a good enough tank in large numbers is not just a production choice, it's a training choice. A simpler, more standardized platform reduces cognitive load. It reduces the variety of parts. It increases the chance that a mechanic has seen this failure before. It increases the chance that a new crew can adapt quickly. Again, it's not glamorous. It is survival. Now, contrast this with the German side late in the war. Germany's armored force increasingly depends on complex machines and shrinking pools of skilled crews. It suffers fuel shortages. It suffers parts shortages. It suffers the relentless pressure of Allied bombing. Even if a German tank is tactically superior, it can be strategically irrelevant if it cannot reach the fight or cannot stay in the fight. This is the moment the T-34's paradox becomes fully visible. The tank is not winning because it is the best tank. It is winning because it is the tank that can exist inside a collapsing world and still function. And if that sounds abstract, picture what it looks like in the field. A Soviet armored column advances. Some tanks break down. They are towed aside. Crews strip parts. The column keeps moving. Replacement tanks arrive days later from a railhead. Mechanics work under tarps in freezing rain. Tanks return to service with mismatched road wheels and welded patches. The army does not pause to mourn every machine. It treats machines like ammunition expended and replenished. The German defender watches this and experiences something psychologically devastating, the feeling that destruction doesn't matter, that you can win the fight in front of you and still lose the war behind it. Because behind the T-34 is the Soviet industrial state, reorganized for total war. And behind that is geography space that swallows invasions and gives you room to rebuild. So if you're asking what was the T-34's most powerful feature, the honest answer might be the Soviet Union. But here's the cliffhanger, the final tightening of the paradox. Endurance is not just a Soviet virtue. It becomes a Soviet vulnerability if it turns into complacency, if the system believes mass alone can solve everything. Because in the last phase of the war, the T-34's strengths collide with a different kind of battlefield: cities, rivers, ambush corridors, and anti-tank teams hiding in ruins. And in those environments, even the endless tank can be bled in ways that production cannot instantly fix. What happens when the battlefield becomes a place where numbers don't automatically translate into victory, and every tank must suddenly be smart? Not just present. The open steppe is where the T-34 feels like destiny. Cities are where destiny bleeds. Late war combat pulls the Red Army into environments that punish exactly what mass production can't fix instantly: visibility, angles, surprise, and the terrifying intimacy of close-range anti-tank ambush. A tank is at its best when it can choose distance, use speed, and keep its threats in a forward arc. A city strips those advantages away. It forces you into corridors. It gives the defender verticality: windows, basements, Rubble piles. It breaks line of sight into 1,000 short, lethal glimpses, and it changes the meaning of thin-skinned. Because even heavy armor is vulnerable at the wrong angle and the wrong range. But a medium tank, especially one that relies on sloped frontal armor, has to survive a battlefield that constantly attacks from the side, from above, from behind. This is where the T-34's legend runs into a different kind of enemy, not the best German tank, but the German anti-tank ecosystem. The late-war German defense leans heavily on ambush tactics and concentrated anti-armor weapons, anti-tank guns placed at intersections, self-propelled guns hidden behind rubble, infantry teams carrying portable anti-tank weapons waiting for a tank to commit to a street. The point isn't to win a sweeping armored duel, it's to carve off vehicles, stall spearheads, and make every block cost time. And time is what the Red Army's offensive needs most. Now take the micro perspective again. You're a Soviet tank commander entering an urban zone. Your vision is through periscopes and narrow slits. Dust and brick powder hang in the air. Every sound echoes. A track squeal becomes a beacon. Your infantry are supposed to be close. But the street is chaotic shell holes, broken walls, smoke, debris. You can't see a team in a window until they fire. You can't easily swing your turret fast enough if you're surprised from the side. You feel the tank's power and also its blindness. This is why late-war Soviet doctrine becomes increasingly obsessed with combined arms in close terrain. Tanks do not clear cities alone. Infantry clear. Tanks support. Engineers breach. Artillery smashes strongpoints. Tanks provide mobile firepower, not invulnerability. In practice, its messy units get separated. Communications fail. Momentum pressures commanders into pushing armor forward before infantry is fully set, and that's when the city eats tanks. The T-3485 helps, but it doesn't magically solve the problem. The 85mm gun provides better high-explosive firepower and improved anti-armor capability, and the improved turret arrangement helps command and awareness. But urban combat is less about gun caliber and more about not being surprised. And surprise in a city is a structural advantage for the defender. Even a crude weapon can be lethal if it is hidden. So you see Soviet advances punctuated by sudden stalls, a tank hit at an intersection, burning and blocking the road, another immobilized and abandoned, crews bailing out under small arms fire, engineers working to clear wrecks while artillery falls. The flow breaks. The offensive rhythm so central to Soviet late-war success hiccups. And then come the rivers. Rivers are like cities in one crucial way: they force predictability. You can't cross anywhere. You cross where bridges exist, where fords are possible, where engineers can build under fire. The defender knows this. So river crossings become concentrated killing zones. Tanks queue. Bottlenecks form. Supply columns stack behind. Artillery finds targets. The whole offensive machine becomes vulnerable precisely because it is a machine. This is the hidden cost of endurance warfare. The more you rely on mass and flow, the more dangerous choke points become. Now zoom out to the macro level. The Soviet Union has built an industrial system capable of feeding huge offensives. But those offensives still depend on operational art, how you coordinate armor, infantry, artillery, air power, engineering, and logistics across moving fronts. The Red Army learned this the hard way. In 1941–42, it often lacked coordination and paid in catastrophes. By 1944–45, it becomes far more sophisticated: deep operations, exploitation groups, artillery preparation at massive scale, engineer support for crossings, and increasingly standardized combined arms practice. And yet, even with improved doctrine, the environment sets limits. A tank that can outrun and outlast Germany's best on open ground can still be stopped by a single burned-out hull in the wrong place. A production miracle can still be slowed by a bridge that doesn't exist. This is where the T-34's outlasted reputation becomes more precise. It didn't outlast Germany by being immune to tactical problems. It outlasted Germany by being embedded in a state and an army that could absorb tactical problems and keep moving anyway. But to do that, the Soviets needed something beyond tanks. They needed artillery, overwhelming artillery. They needed engineers, relentless engineers. They needed logistics, fuel and rails and repair depots. And, crucially, they needed the psychological stamina to keep fighting through the attrition of cities and rivers without losing operational purpose. So when people talk about the Red Army steamrolling west, it hides the truth. Steamrollers still slow down when the ground changes. Now, the final cliffhanger question. If the T-34's strength is that it keeps coming, what does it do to the human beings inside that system? Because there's a cost to treating tanks like consumables. There's a cost to an army that can replace machines faster than it can replace experienced crews. And by the end of the war, the Red Army has not only a mountain of wrecked steel behind it, but a generation of men shaped by a kind of warfare that turns survival into a statistical miracle. If you want the T-34 to be a clean legend, you focus on the silhouette sloped armor, wide tracks, a gun pointing west. If you want the truth, you listen to the people who lived inside it. Because the T-34's greatest advantage, its ability to exist in vast numbers, creates a kind of warfare that quietly devalues the individual machine. And when a machine is replaceable, the line between machine and crew can start to blur in how commanders think, even if no one says it out loud. That's the uncomfortable part of industrial war. It encourages you to treat human beings like the consumable component of a system. And on the Eastern Front, the system is merciless. Start with crews. A Soviet tanker's life is defined by extremes, long stretches of exhausting movement or waiting, interrupted by moments of sudden violence where you're trapped inside a metal box that becomes either a weapon or a coffin. The psychological load is unique. In infantry combat, you can drop, crawl, run. In a tank, you have limited options. If something goes wrong, fire. Penetration. Immobilization, you have seconds to decide whether to fight, flee, or die. And the T-34, especially early in the war, is not built for comfort. It's loud. It's hot in summer, freezing in winter, damp and suffocating in rain. The crew works in cramped conditions that amplify stress. The sights and periscopes are your tiny portals to the world. And if they're obscured by dust or cracked by shock, you're fighting blind. Communication is a constant challenge. Radios are not universal early on, and even when they are present, they can be unreliable. You're often coordinating by flags, by intuition, by watching other tanks move, meaning when the battlefield breaks into smoke and chaos, control evaporates. Now compare that to German crew ergonomics and optics. It's not a simple better versus worse narrative. But the German design approach often prioritizes crew efficiency and observation. In many tactical situations, that translates into first-shot advantage. So why do Soviet crews keep coming? Because the war forces them into it. Because the front consumes entire units. Because retreat is often not an option. And because the Soviet state and military culture, especially in the early desperate years, places brutal emphasis on holding, pushing, enduring. Now move to the factory floor. This is where the industrial morality becomes almost surreal. The people building T-34s are not living inside a normal economy. They are living inside a national emergency, where the output of steel is measured against the output of death. In relocated plants east of the Urals, workers labor in bitter cold, with shortages, long shifts, minimal rest. The assembly line becomes a kind of battlefield without bullets. And the war asks them for speed. Speed means simplification. Simplification means roughness. Roughness means the crews at the front receive machines that may have quirks, inconsistencies, defects, and the crews adapt. They learn to expect that some tanks arrive with problems. They learn to treat the vehicle as something that will need constant attention. The boundary between production and maintenance blurs. The tank isn't finished when it rolls out of the factory. It's finished when it survives its first campaign. This creates a grim cycle. Production feeds the front. The front feeds wrecks back into repair depots. Repair depots feed patched machines back to units. It's a circulatory system built from metal and pressure. Now, here's where the paradox becomes sharper. When we say the T-34 outlasted Germany's best, we often imagine it outlasting tigers and panthers, but in many cases, it outlasted Germany by outlasting Germany's ability to sustain the war at all economically, logistically, psychologically. Germany's high-performance machines were terrifying, but the German system increasingly suffered from the fragility of complexity and the fragility of a shrinking trained manpower pool. The Soviet system, by contrast, was designed to survive extreme attrition by rebuilding faster than it broke. That is not a pretty advantage. It is a brutal one. And it changes the way a war feels on the ground. German soldiers and tankers start to report a kind of despairing astonishment. We destroy them. And still they come. It's not that the T-34 is invincible. It's that the Soviet system refuses to interpret loss as a stopping condition. This is the moral ambiguity of endurance warfare. It can look like heroism from one angle and like mechanized sacrifice from another. Now we have to address the title's laughed-at element. Because it isn't only German mockery, it's also internal cynicism. Early in the war, some Soviet crews and commanders distrust the machine not because it's bad in concept, but because the execution can be inconsistent and the learning curve is brutal. A tank that is theoretically excellent but practically hard to operate under pressure can feel like betrayal. You're told you have a superior weapon, then you're stranded by a gearbox failure under fire. That experience creates a kind of dark humor, one of the few ways soldiers mentally survive long campaigns. But the T-34 story is the story of adaptation as much as production. The Red Army evolves, training improves, doctrine improves, communication improves. The T-34 evolves into the T-3485. Combined arms becomes more integrated. Artillery coordination becomes devastatingly effective. Engineer support becomes systematic. The machine becomes easier to use not because it becomes elegant, but because the army around it learns how to use it in ways that reduce its weaknesses. So the tank becomes a mirror of the war itself, rough at first, then hardened, then sharpened, and by late 1944 and 1945, you can find Soviet armored units that operate with a kind of grim professionalism, fast exploitation, coordinated assaults, rapid repairs, disciplined movement. The early chaos is not fully gone, but it is constrained by learned experience. Now here's the final twist before we close the story. If the T-34 is the symbol of industrial endurance, its true legacy is not only that it helped win a war, it's that it proved a modern rule in total war. Strategy belongs to the side that can turn society into sustained output without collapsing. And that rule doesn't end in 1945. It echoes into every later industrial conflict, every arms race, every system where production capacity becomes a form of power. So the cliffhanger is not about the next battle. It's about the meaning. Because once you accept that a crude machine can dominate by being mass-produced and constantly repaired, you're forced to confront a haunting question. Did the T-34 win because it was a brilliant tank, or because it was the perfect expression of a state willing to pay any price to keep the front moving? By the end of the war, the T-34 is everywhere, and that everywhere is the point. Not because the tank is flawless, not because it wins every duel, not because it's the most comfortable or the most technically sophisticated vehicle to ever roll on tracks, but because it forces a new definition of what battlefield superiority actually means in total war. And if you want a verdict that respects the complexity, it sounds like this. The T-34 was not the best tank. It was the best answer to the war it was actually fighting. That answer is built on 3 pillars, each one more important than the gun caliber debates people love. First, survivable mobility. On the Eastern Front, mobility isn't speed on a road. It's movement through mud, snow, broken ground, and destroyed infrastructure. The T-34's wide tracks lower ground pressure, and its overall design philosophy prioritizes staying operational in bad terrain. This doesn't mean it never bogs down. It means it bogs down less often than many opponents in the same conditions. And in a war of relentless movement and collapse, less often becomes decisive. Second, efficient protection. Sloped armor isn't invincibility. It's weight efficiency. It means you can get meaningful ballistic resistance without turning your tank into a fuel-hungry, bridge-breaking giant. The T-34's armor scheme represents a compromise that makes sense in a war where the front is massive. The roads are poor, and logistics are brutal. It is protection designed for a system, not for a trophy cabinet. Third, industrial compatibility. This is the one that matters most. The T-34's design could be simplified, standardized, and produced under extreme pressure. It could tolerate roughness. It could be repaired with cannibalized parts. It could exist inside a production and maintenance ecosystem that valued throughput over perfection. If you reduce the war to a single statistic, the Soviet armored force becomes less about any individual tank and more about the fact that tanks keep arriving even after catastrophic losses. Now, to be fair, the criticism is real and it's part of the truth. The early T-34's ergonomics and command and control limitations are not minor. A two-man turret strains the commander. Early optics and situational awareness issues can be fatal against well-coordinated German units. Reliability problems are not propaganda from the enemy. They are the cost of a system forced into speed and simplification. Many crews paid for those compromises in fire and smoke. And yet those compromises are also what allowed the Soviet Union to keep producing and fielding armored forces at the scale needed to win. This is where the titles laughed at becomes almost symbolic rather than literal. People laugh at the T-34 because they judge it by peacetime engineering instincts, neat welds, smooth finishes, perfect machining. But the Eastern Front is not a peacetime environment. The tank is built for a war where the real opponent is not only Germany's gunnery, but the destruction of your own industrial base, the starvation of your supply lines, the freezing of your lubricants, and the exhaustion of your workforce. The T-34 is, in that sense, the tank equivalent of a blunt survival strategy: simplify, standardize, accept loss, rebuild, repeat. And the story of the T-348-5 seals the verdict. When the Soviets upgrade the turret and gun, they implicitly acknowledge that industrial mass alone isn't enough. Tactical efficiency matters when you're exploiting advances, fighting in complex terrain, and meeting improved enemy defenses. The T-34 platform adapts without stopping production. That is one of the most underappreciated achievements of the entire war, evolving a major weapons system while maintaining output under pressure. Now, here's the deeper legacy. The reason this story still matters. The T-34 becomes a template for modern warfare, thinking robustness beats elegance when conditions are extreme. Not always, not in every conflict, but in total war. Robustness means your weapon can survive not only the enemy, but your own chaos. That lesson echoes in later armored design philosophies, the emphasis on ease of production, maintainability, logistics, and field repairability. The idea that a tank is part of an ecosystem: fuel, spare parts, training, recovery becomes impossible to ignore. The best tank isn't the one that looks unbeatable in isolation. It's the one your system can keep operating at scale for months and years. Which brings us back to the paradox we opened with. A tank mocked for being crude became the symbol of battlefield survival and industrial endurance. It did that by embodying the Soviet Union's wartime logic: sacrifice refinement, preserve output, and treat replacement as strategy. It's not a comfortable legacy, but it is a historically honest one. And if you're sitting there thinking, so was the T-34 a masterpiece or a mass-produced compromise? The answer is yes. It was a compromise that became a masterpiece of context. The T-34 didn't win because it was perfect. It won because it was present again and again until the enemy's advantages became irrelevant under the weight of sustained pressure. So the final thought, the one that should linger after the last frame. When people argue about who had the best tank of World War II, they're often arguing about duels. The T-34 forces you to argue about wars. And wars are won by the side that can keep building, keep repairing, keep training, keep supplying long after the romance of engineering has been burned off by mud and time.